We're connected. Welcome to the third podcast of Traditional Lives, where we are going back to the original Hebrew text and auditing the efforts of the King James translators. And so we talked about in the previous two podcasts of why we're doing this, and we discussed how several words in the Hebrew text were transliterated and not translated. So Jonah sounds like the Hebrew word Yonah, so it was transliterated and not translated, and we learned that Jonah means dove. All right, so today we on this podcast we want to talk about the word et in Hebrew. The word "et" is spelled with the first letter and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the first letter being Aleph and the last letter being Tav. Now, the reason why we selected this word as our first word is because this word exists 7,372 times in the original text and is never translated in the English translations. Wow, right? All right, so what is this word? What is Aleph Tav? Well, our Savior in the book of Revelation declared himself to be the first and the last, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. Well, Alpha is the first letter of Hebrew and Omega is the last letter of Hebrew. And so the English translations chose to provide us the first letter and the last letter of Greek. But we know that our Savior spoke in Hebrew, his father's language. And so the equivalent of Aleph of Alpha and Omega in Greek is the Aleph and the Tav in Hebrew. And so it would just make so much sense now when you consider that he said he is a word that exists 7,372 times in the Old Testament original text and is not translated. Wow. What a discovery, right? Well, Yeshua is our Savior's given Hebrew name, and transliterated is Jesus, but the translation of Yeshua is salvation. So our Savior's name, Yeshua, means salvation, and salvation says his name that he says he is Aleph Tav. And so it's not real difficult to say that the word et translated to English is salvation. But now, when you go into the 7,372 occurrences of this word, and you replace or you insert the word salvation where this word is located in those texts, it creates grammatical difficulty beyond description because the rest of the words of that text were also translated without including salvation in the translation. So it creates a lot of clumsiness in trying to read that verse when you just insert the word salvation into the verse. Let me give you an example. In Genesis 1:1, the word Aleph Tav occurs twice. So it says in the translations, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, we're not going to do it on this podcast, but put the word salvation in two times, twice. Put the word salvation into that verse twice and look at the clumsiness, the difficulty of explaining what that verse really means. It creates incredible difficulty to insert the word salvation two times in the first verse. The word Aleph Tav et exists 12 times in the 10 commandments. Imagine adding the word salvation 12 times in the 10 commandments. And so you're seeing my point here. How do we take one word that is not translated and insert it into a translation that omitted it without creating grammatical difficulties for reading? You can't. You had to negotiate the translation of that word from the beginning and look at the impact of that word on the words around it. The Hebrew text does that. The original text, it's not difficult in the original text, but because the translation removed the word, then the entire intent of the text is modified because salvation was removed from the translation. That's a pretty difficult thing to comprehend, right? And so when you consider, as we go through this process and we keep adding more and more words that were either transliterated or not translated at all, it makes it makes our podcast more interesting, yet more conflicting and more it creates debate for the church, debate for people who have not gone through the effort to learn Hebrew. But I'll assure you that I understand now there's 4 million Christians that now know how to read and research Hebrew. And once you learn Hebrew, how to read and research Hebrew, the conversation I'm having, you would go to the other side. You would call me and say, "Hey, Mark, you gotta give these people more information. You can't leave all this stuff out." You would have the exact opposite opinion of what we're sharing if you know Hebrew than if you don't. I'll give you one more example. If you take the word Aleph Tav, et, and you add one letter to the end, Hebrew is read from right to left. So the first letter is Aleph, the second letter is Tav. If you add the letter Hey, the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet means revelation or grace. And before there were letters, it was a pictograph language, and the picture of the letter Hey, prior to letters being brought into the conversation, was a man jumping up and down because he's so excited about what he just learned. So Aleph Tav Hey. So revelation, salvation, revelation. It's the revelation is after the words, which means when it's afterwards, it's salvation to be revealed. And salvation to be, if salvation's going to be revealed, it's going to be revealed by the translation of the word Aleph Tav Hey, which is the word you. If they're going to know about Aleph Tav, you have to tell them. That's Aleph Tav Hey is you. Isn't that beautiful? And so the entire language just flows that way. You learn this letter, you learn this word, you add a letter, and more beauty comes into it. And so Aleph Tav, salvation, 7,372 times in the original text and not translated into any English translation. Bye.